And one thing that we are very well aware of our suffering, and many times we don't know what to do with it. And main thing how we deal with our suffering is we always fight with suffering. We fight so that we will win over the suffering. And on the process of fighting with the suffering, and we want to gain happiness, but instead of gaining happiness, we gain more suffering as a result of fighting with the suffering. So when we deal with the suffering, we fight with suffering, and we create more suffering. And then again, there's a more suffering. We fight with it, again, there's a more suffering. So we kind of feel very overwhelmed with that. We know that we should not be fighting with the suffering. And on the other hand, then we go into another extreme of dealing with our suffering, is that we avoid. We try to avoid our suffering. And best way to avoid our suffering that we find is we run away from the suffering. Just kind of like don't look at the suffering and don't pay attention to the suffering. And if you, like many times, like we teach this technique, like be optimistic. Don't think about the suffering. If you think about the suffering, then you will have a more suffering. So that is our way of dealing with the suffering. So mainly, we deal with our own suffering is either we fight with it or either we avoid it. So these are the two methods that most people know. And this is the method that most people, I will say 99% of human beings and also sentient beings are dealing with their suffering in that way. Either fight it or either avoid it. And then there is not much technique or method that is practiced by people like, really trying to understand the suffering. And either when we fight with suffering or we avoid the suffering, this either technique, neither of these technique actually trying to connect with the suffering, right? We are not really connecting with suffering. If you fight with the suffering, you're not really connecting with the suffering. If you avoid the suffering, you're not really connecting with the suffering. So suffering is there. Why suffering is there? So that we can learn something from that. So actually, suffering, negativities, negative part of our life, it exists, it is there. And it is there. Everybody has a negativity, everybody has a suffering. And main thing, the suffering is there so that we can learn from the suffering. If there is no suffering, we cannot learn. So that is why, like, the main purpose of having a suffering in our life or in existence is to learn, not to fight or not to avoid. Just kind of thing is about acceptance, which is very difficult. Acceptance, that's where the spiritual, point start. Acceptance is very difficult. And when we fight or when we avoid, this is not the sign of accepting, right? It is not a sign of accepting. It is more sort of like, not connecting. So that is why Tonglen practice is a very powerful method to connect with the suffering, to really connect with the suffering. And we don't have to search for suffering because suffering is very available in every moment of our life, right? It is available. It is just, it is everywhere you go, you can find it. And it is there, like all the time. And that object that we are dealing, it is there. So this practice, Tonglen, is made to use that, to accept that, to connect that. So before I go into the Tonglen practice, first I want to share what is the point of why we want to accept the suffering. It is a weird, philosophy or theory, because in the worldly religion, in the world, our philosophy is either avoid the suffering or fight with the suffering. That is our philosophy.